Tom, this morning, as always, I was watching the business news like I do when I usually wake up in the morning. And they were talking about, they had John Taffer on of Bar Rescue fame. I don't know if you've ever seen his show.
Many episodes.
But I'm a big John Taffer fan. And he was talking about the shortage of workers in the restaurant industry right now. John's based out of Vegas, does shows all over the country, but he lives full-time in Vegas. He knows the Vegas scene. That's where he sort of made his way. And he was talking about, and they were showing video of going down the Vegas Strip, and usually on all these marquees of all these Vegas hotels, they're usually saying
Wayne Newton performing tonight.
I don't know the last time they were promoting Wayne Newton, but
all the shows, right?
Yeah, all the shows and all the deals and all the big things that are happening. And now he says every sign, and you saw this, every sign, help wanted. We're hiring incentives for just doing an interview. I even heard a story a week ago. We might have even talked about this on the last podcast. I don't remember for sure. McDonald's was offering a $50 incentive simply for filling out an application. You didn't have to take the job if they offered to. You didn't have to do anything. But if you filled out an application and did an interview, they were going to give you a $50 in cash. And we've seen it.
What's going on, Dave? Are people just become lazy? They don't want to work?
Well, it's what happens when the government decides to just give you money. What we've seen is the expansion of unemployment benefits that they're relating to the COVID lockdowns. Although it's sort of suspect that before COVID, we were talking about universal basic incomes.
Right.
And we were talking about how these really Marxist ideas of universal basic income where everybody just has enough to survive. And you hear from all of these people, you hear from the Marxists on that side. They all give you the same answer. They say, look, just make sure everybody can live. Just make sure everybody has a house. Make sure everybody can afford food. And people are going to go to work. They're going to want to work. It's in our nature. They're going to want to go and do it. Which, first of all, when they say it's in our nature, I wonder if they actually understand what they're talking about, because I thought they don't believe in consistent human nature. But I think consistent human nature is you're going to make it so I don't have to work, so I can go do whatever I want all day. That's when people end up starting to go travel as much as they want, go spend their day hiking, go spend their day doing something, laying in bed, watching TV, whatever it is they want to do. I don't know that work is ever going to be the top of their priority.
They're subsidizing idleness is what they're really doing. Which
they've been doing for 100 plus years.
And let's just for a moment here, real briefly, let's dig into let's do a quick economic analysis of that. What if someone's living on unemployment right now for a year? About how much would they be bringing in, roughly?
As far as I understand this, it's somewhere around $42,000.
$42,000 to do nothing.
Correct.
And so let's say someone offers a job. It's a significant job. It's a $75,000 a year salary job.
Right.
Now think about the calculation from the person living on unemployment. It's not $75,000. First of all, you're going to pay a lot of taxes. So let's just round it off and say you're actually going to bring home $60,000. $60,000.
It puts you in a new tax bracket, right?
Right. $60,000 versus $42,000 to do nothing. So what's the real advantage? What is the incentive here? $18,000. So the question is, should I go work 40, 50 hours a week full time for $18,000? Even though the job being offered has a $75,000 salary, what it really means is $18,000 to go work all the time, or just live off my $42,000 to do whatever I want. And what we're seeing is a whole lot of people across the country say, yeah, I'll just stick with this unemployment.
Right. So if they're going to stick with unemployment, it's funny. I think about all of my friends who like to go out and enjoy, especially in Colorado and New York. We've got these vibrant restaurant and bar scenes where you like to go out and you like to meet people, and it's a great way to socialize. And everybody's been just craving that opportunity as we're coming out of the lockdowns, as we're now at, I think Colorado is now called the blue level, where you can be at more open capacity and everything else. And everybody's anxious for that. And guess what? The restaurants can't be open. And the restaurants can't be open because they don't have the staff to do it. So you're getting your $42,000 And you got to go to Florida, you got to go to Texas, you got to go to the open states to actually go find that social atmosphere. And over the weekend, I noticed all of my friends left town.
One of our favorite restaurants where one of our Vino Veritas Society chapters meets on a regular basis, they've been closed recently on the weekends simply because they don't have enough staff. They can't get staff to show up to work.
It's not even to show up to work. They can't even find anybody to hire.
Yeah.
People all left when all of this happened. They all started moving. They all went on to find different things to do, and they can't even hire anybody. Nobody shows up people aren't even showing up for interviews anymore.
So can we conclude Marxism doesn't work very well?
Well, I think this is a big example of that, right? The example that they like to cite, that these Marxist socialist progressives like to cite, is just make sure everybody's comfortable and everybody has a house and everybody has food, and you're going to have really good, happy people, and those people are going to be happy enough that they're going to want to go to work and they're going to want to go do something productive.
Yep.
And we're just seeing that's not the case.
Turns out incentives really do matter.
Right.
And so wouldn't it be great if we could say, well, the good news is Marxism is dead and gone. We don't have to worry about it. It doesn't exist anymore in the United States or just around the fringes. And it turns out just the opposite is true. Marxism right now, today, in 2021, the United States of America, Marxism is thriving. It's growing and expanding, and it's not even being called Marxism. It's growing under the veil of critical race theory,
right.
which is a remarkable thing. And I think a number of progressive Marxist types in recent decades have realized that in many audiences that label Marxism or communism doesn't sell very well. Socialism is kind of a mixed bag. There are many Americans who actually think socialism is a good idea, even though they're not clear on how socialism is different exactly from communism or Marxism. But they've made a choice here to say, let's disguise our Marxism and let's call it critical race theory. And what we're seeing is this just explosion of critical race theory ideas being infused into almost every aspect of modern life in the United States, training that's being conducted at the very highest level. The United States State Department, the FBI, the CIA, the Treasury Department, all these bureaucracies that make up the swamp, the Department of Transportation. They are conducting critical race theory training with all their staff, and it's gone beyond government. It's in our schools,
right.
And not just public schools. A lot of private schools look at this as this is cutting edge progressive social philosophy. Therefore, we want to offer it to students. Many, many instances are being recorded across the country where they divide students based on skin color, and then they won't let, little white kids speak for an hour and a half because if they say anything at all, this is just an exercise in their oppressive white culture and ridiculous things like this. Churches are picking it up. Professional sports. It's infused there, right? It's in our corporate boardrooms, including some of the largest companies in the world. Coca-Cola, right? I'm not talking about just the little mom and pop shop down the street.
Right.
I'm talking about huge, multinational, billion-dollar corporations are telling their employees who have white skin, don't act so white. And this is all part of critical race theory.
So let's take a step back because I think a lot of people, and I'd say there's a portion of our audience, although I think our members are a little bit more savvy than the average person.
Oh, I think they're a lot more savvy.
Well,
come on, Dave. They listen to us.
I hope that helps. I hope that's a good thing. So I think a lot of people understand Marxism as a critique on capitalism.
Yep.
They look at Marxism strictly from an economic lens rather than a social lens. And it's funny because you and I talk all the time that capitalism is a social construct as well. It's not an economic construct.
Yeah.
The economic effects that come out of the social construct of capitalism are pretty clear, but capitalism in and of itself is a moral social construct.
Right.
In the same way that Marxism is is a social construct.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth taking a minute to take that little step back and talk about, you bring up critical race theory as a Marxist concept. Critical race theory comes out of Marx's original critical theory, which was taught in the Frankfurt School from the 1890s through the 1930s.
Yeah.
So maybe spend a little bit of time, if you could, just giving people some background on both critical theory and critical race theory, so that we're all coming at it from the same definition, so that we all understand what it is appropriately.
Let's dig into Karl Marx for a little bit, and then I'll sort of tie it back to how Marxism is infused into modern day critical race theory. So one of the great blessings I had in life, and I genuinely mean this, I'm not being sarcastic, I had an undergraduate professor who became a very good friend of mine. He and I spent great amounts of time together. I sat in virtually every class he ever taught while I was in college, whether I was enrolled or not. I would just go sit in the back of the room for some of his classes. And we had the kind of friendship. He wasn't that much older than me when I was, 19, 20. He probably would have been late 20s or early 30s, newly minted PhD. And there was a bar right across the street on campus from his office. And on Friday afternoons, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we'd go sit over there and have a beer. And we'd have Marx or Plato or Machiavelli or, whatever books we were reading at that time. We'd take them with us and sit there and argue as we drink beer. And honestly, it was one of the greatest learning moments of my life. And I mention him because he was a thorough student and disciple of Karl Marx. Mm-hmm. He was a genuine, well-read, thoughtful Marxist, meaning he was a Marxist. He came to Marxism by reading and studying the writings of Marx, not just by picking up little aphorisms and sayings and slogans out in the political world, but a deep intellectual study. And
you mean he didn't go on some website and fill out some answers to some questions and it told him you're a Marxist?
Right. No,
I
like
like
that.
this one line that you pulled out of Karl Marx's writing, and if I like that line, I must be a Marxist.
Well, when I knew him, this was before the age of websites. Al Gore hadn't perfected the internet yet, and we didn't have any websites.
He needed to invent time travel first.
That's right.
Apparently.
So one of the things about Marx that I think is important, and so I spent 4 years with this mentor, professor of mine, and read virtually everything Marx wrote, including a lot of his unpublished work and letters. And one of the important things to know about Marx offers this theory that is comprehensive. He claims to account for all human phenomena, everything, human action, human choices, human institutions, the operations of the mind, of the brain. I mean, he claims to give a total account of the entire human world, and so it's a little daunting. And I will also add, there is a significant degree of an internal logic if you grant certain premises of Marx's. The rest of his theory holds together fairly well. Not perfectly, but fairly well. All this is to say, Marx was not stupid. He was not a shallow thinker. He wasn't crazy. He was fundamentally wrong, and his errors led to disastrous, murderous, tyrannical results. But he himself was not a stupid man. And there's a couple key pieces here in Marx, and I'll sort of build this up to where I think is the real connection with critical race theory. First of all, Marx, I wrote a piece years ago describing Marx as a psychologist, first and foremost, not an economist, not a political theorist. I think what Marx was really after, his real goal was to change the human psyche, the way human beings think. Marx was a thorough materialist, and he explains this over and over and over. What he meant by that, we use that word today to mean, someone who's so shallow they only care about what kind of car you drive or material belongings.
Madonna, the material girl.
The material girl, right, exactly. Marx meant something much more fundamental. He meant the only reality is physical reality. This desk right here, this cup, this book, physical things. For Marx, there is no metaphysical realm. The realm of what we call abstract ideas, he says, doesn't exist. There's just physical reality. For Marx, there is no such thing as a free mind. There's certainly no soul. There's no soul. There's no mind, really. What there is a brain.
Right.
And a brain is physical matter, and the brain is made of atoms and molecules, right? And physical things bumping into each other.
It's really a counterpoint to Aristotle or to Plato.
Very much, yes. Where Plato says everything has, we'll give just a quick here, a little taste of Platonism. So Plato would say, right, you say this is a cup, right? And yet there can be different kinds of cups, different colors, slightly different shapes, different sizes. There can be great big cups. There can be little tiny, a dollhouse. You can have little tiny cups. But there is a form of a cup. And that's how the mind knows that this is a cup and this thing is not a cup, right? Because this doesn't have the form of a cup. This does have the form. And that form is colorless. It doesn't have a texture. It doesn't have any kind of those physical qualities. It's an abstract idea. And this is why Plato talked about the realm of the ideas or the forms.
Right.
Marx rejects all that. There's no such thing as an abstract idea. There are just particular physical things. And it also raises a huge question that Marxists have been debating ever since. Can there be something like free will? If there really is just brain, there is no mind, there's no soul, there's just brain, and the brain is a physical thing, and there are chemicals and neurons, right, bumping it into each other. What we experience as thinking is really just a bunch of almost like billiard balls, in our head bouncing into each other. Then are we really free beings? And that's something Marxists have never. There's an ongoing dispute about that.
Well, it also directly counteracts the Aristotle theory of God and beast and being able to use reason.
That's right, absolutely. And so for Marx, everything, all of what we call our ideas, our assumptions about the world that we hold in our head are really shaped by our physical environment. And so his prediction was, if we can eliminate private property by law, not allow private property, which will lead to nobody owning anything, that concept of property will eventually fade away after a generation or two or three, because no one will experience private property. Therefore, no one will think of the idea of private property. And it goes more. If there is nothing for me to own, I can't own anything, including myself. I don't own anything. Is there an I? If I don't own anything, is there an I? Is there a self? I think Marx's ultimate goal was to abolish the concept of self so that human beings only thought in terms of the we, the commune, the communal, hence communism, that I don't have any interests apart from yours and everyone else around us. We have common interests. There is no self-interest. There's just the interests of the commune, of the community. And once we get to that place, this is Marx's prediction. At that point, we don't need government. Marx, a lot of critics of Marx forget this. Marx is something of an anarchist, or at least he predicts a future after the communist revolution of a stateless society. The withering away of the state is how he describes it. We won't need government. We won't need police. We won't need courts. We won't need armies. Once the communist revolution has swept around the globe, because our interests are all the same as each other's. My interest is inseparable from your interest, and it's inseparable from the interests of everyone around us. So there won't even be a concept like of stealing. We would, in effect, be stealing from ourselves, because we are the community. So this is where Marx goes, and that means the abolition of private property is foundational. It is indispensable for his entire revolutionary platform. Now, we know what happened. A number of regimes adopted this this theory and tried to put it into practice. And the results were horrific. The results were murderous on scales no one had ever witnessed before. The building of gigantic death camps and famines that swept across and caused the deaths of tens of millions of people at a time. It was terrible. And so Marxists started rethinking how to brand, how to rebrand, repackage, represent Marxism.
So that people didn't think about Lenin and Stalin and Mao.
Yes. And all this really can be traced back in the United States, in the American context, to the 1960s. What's going on in the 1960s? Big fights over Jim Crow versus civil rights and race. The topic of race was right, in the middle of that. The legacy of slavery and equality versus equality under the law. All these things were the cause of a great social disruption in the United States. And this really is where critical race theory is rooted. This is the moment from which it emerges. It gains steam in the late 1980s, early 1990s in academic departments of political science, sociology, psychology, the social sciences. And basically what critical race theory does is it says, okay, rather than thinking of the great conflict is between workers versus the capitalists.
Right.
That was Marx's thing, right? There's this ongoing conflict between those who work in the factories and on the farms versus those who own the means of production. And Marx argued that tension, that conflict can only be resolved through revolution when the workers slaughter all the capitalists and take possession of the means of production.
Just a little tangent on that to bring it into the news of the week.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw earlier this week the news out of Simon & Schuster Publishing. The staff at Simon & Schuster are revolting against management for publishing Mike Pence's new book. So Mike Pence, who a lot of Trump people are angry with because they didn't like the way he handled the
counting
election,
of the
electoral votes.
Yeah.
He's also still part of the Trump administration, so he's still hated by the woke left.
Right.
And they are revolting against their managers, saying, "We're going to walk out if you publish this book."
Right. So much for the free press, right? How about a censored, politically correct press?
Right.
This is part of Marx's prediction that there will be a revolution. This conflict is going to grow and grow and grow. The capitalists are going to get increasingly wealthy. The gap between the wealthy capitalists and the working poor is going to become so wide, and the anger and the hatred and the resentment is going to become so uncontrolled among the workers that they will launch a violent attack. They will slaughter the capitalists. They will take ownership of the means of production communally, as a community of workers, as a commune, and thus why you have to get rid of private property in every way. What critical race theory does is it substitutes, rather than talking about workers versus capitalists, it says black versus white.
Right.
Almost everything else follows the same. Just don't talk about that class conflict, rich and poor. Let's present it in terms of race conflict. White people have been oppressing and disenfranchising and stealing from and looting black people. Now it's time for the revolution. And the revolution is going to mean something like people who have been oppressed, people of color, all these minority groups really need to do something like come and take away the means of production. And this is how we get terms, some of the prominent voices out there in the world of critical race theory. There's a book that is not a very good book, but has been wildly popular, titled White Fragility by an author named Robin DiAngelo. There's an academic named Ibram Kendi, who's at the University of Boston. They've created an entire center, a center for critical race theory studies that he directs.
And they're creating curriculum to go out to younger, to the K through 12 primary, secondary education. to teach that.
Which is being promoted by none other than the sitting president of the United States, who has said we need more, and he's instructing the United States Department of Education to infuse critical race theory, including materials from the 1619 Project, materials being produced by Kendi's Center for Race Studies at Boston University, and other kind of material, and that's going out there. And here's another interesting, the critical race theorists of today, they're much more aware, I think, of language than earlier generation of Marxists. Marxists 50 years ago, 100 years ago, talked openly about revolution. One of their favorite terms was struggle. I mean, this was a philosophic term of art within the Marxist lexicon. You struggle to cause the revolution. The struggle is critically important. And I think critical race theorists today, they don't talk that way. They don't talk openly about the revolution, about the struggle. They don't talk about the class conflict. What they talk about are terms that on their face sound kind of good. Equity.
Fairness,
diversity,
right?
Inclusiveness or inclusion. They'll talk about the problems of privilege. They'll talk about microaggression. I mean, nobody wants to be around aggressive people.
Right.
Of course, we should know about these things. The subtle little things like they have changed. We own a business. What do we call anyone who owns a piece of the Vino Veritas Society? We call them a shareholder. They literally own some shares, right? They have equity in the business because they own some shares. But what critical race theorists will talk about are stakeholders.
Right.
Stakeholders is a much larger group of people who maybe don't legally own a business or an entity, but their interests are affected by it.
Right.
And therefore they, the larger community using government power, should be able to control a business because they're stakeholders, even though they're not shareholders. And so these terms are terms that most of them have, the regular traditional definition seems innocuous, sometimes even seems like a good thing, like a helpful thing. But just take that idea of equity. When they don't talk about equality, and certainly not equality in terms of the American founding, the way that equality, for example, we see it in the Declaration of Independence.
Sure.
Equality there means equality of natural rights, equality of natural liberty, right? All human beings are equal. They're unequal in all kinds of ways, but they're equal in one decisive way. Every human being has a rightful claim to his own life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right. And equal laws should protect that private property and those natural rights. That's equality in the founding. Equity, the way that critical race theorists talk, really requires a forced transfer of private wealth. If you're a minority, if you have dark color skin, then for you to have equity in modern society really means reparations for injustices that were done to your ancestors a long time ago, whether you're aware of it or not. And so the whole idea of private property is incompatible with the notion of equity and stakeholder and these kinds of terms being thrown around by critical race theory. And that's the way Marxism is creeping into American politics, into our education, into our culture, not being branded as Marxism,
right,
being branded as critical race theorists. And it also allows those promoting critical race theorists to label anyone who disagrees as a racist.
Right.
You're a racist. If you defend private property, then by definition you are a racist. You're arguing for this system that has oppressed people. Mr. Kendi, the fellow at Boston University, he has said very clearly, to be an anti-racist requires that you be anti-capitalist.
Right. Well, so it's interesting. You said creep in. I think it's flowing in like tidal waves. The image that came to my mind was the scene when the elevator opens in The Shining.
Oh.
But
right,
we're not talking about
right,
just kind of creeping in.
Right.
What I think is interesting is the term equity has almost replaced, they never wanted to say equality of outcomes. Right. First, it was equality of opportunity, but the real goal when they used to say, and this is in the 60s, 70s, they would say equality of opportunity, but what they really wanted was equality of outcomes.
Who's the they you're talking about?
The Marxists, the progressives, the people who were starting to, at that time, that's when I would say the Marxism was starting to creep in. Now it's the flood. But the Marxists and the progressives at the time were trying to talk about things. They would say things like equality of opportunity. What they really wanted was equality of outcomes. Equity is sort of the new term for equality of outcomes. We want to create a world where everyone has equal equity, where everybody has equal opportunity after the work is done, where everybody, they talk about same pay for same work when we all know it's really never the same work and none of us are alike. If I go sign an NBA contract today, I don't deserve the same kind of money that Nikola Jokic from the Nuggets is getting, right? The guy's an MVP candidate. He's 7 feet tall and he can shoot 3-pointers. I'll never do that.
Let's remind our listeners, this is so fundamental. I see this meme floating around on social media, or some version of it many times, where it'll have LeBron James and one of the stars of the WNBA. And and it shows their comparative stats, and there's a lot of similarities. They both work very hard. There's no doubt about it, and they're both really talented, high-level athletes. But the woman in the WNBA makes a tiny fraction. She's making $200,000 or $300,000 a year, whereas LeBron James is making many millions of dollars a year. And the conclusion is this is a gross injustice, right? Because they're doing equal work, they should be paid the same. And yet the price of something, including how much a salary someone is paid, reflects value, and value is determined by the beholders. It's in the eye of the beholders.
Right.
And the truth is large numbers of people, diminishing because the NBA has become so politicized, but still large numbers of people value watching professional level men's basketball. Very few people relative to that. Much smaller number of people value watching professional level women's basketball. Not nearly as many people will buy tickets. Not nearly as many people want to watch it on TV, which means they can't sell advertising, right? Which means there's just not as much revenue coming into the WNBA because people don't value it as much.
Right. So we have this whole idea of equity as the outcome-based equality of outcomes. What's really interesting, and I think what's worth looking at next in this whole conversation, is we saw that transformation start in the 60s. We really saw it starting with the civil rights movement. We saw it coming through with a lot of the things that supposedly the government was doing at the time with the Great Society, although I will always believe, and I think we know now as fact, they had elections in mind when they were making changes with the Great Society.
Oh, absolutely.
It was never really about helping people. But go back before that, right? And go back before, and we saw what really was a black community that didn't need government's help. We saw a black community that had really been treated poorly. And I'm gonna say something that some of our listeners might be surprised to hear, but you and I have talked about this. If you had talked about reparations to me in the 1870s and 1880s coming right out of the Civil War, and you could have specifically said, you white slave owner, you Southern white slave owner.
A particular person.
Right. Yeah. You specific person, you owned these 50 slaves and you've got all of your records, and we know exactly who you owned and what you made them do and how you abused them and how you took advantage of them, how you violated their natural rights. You owe them reparations. I'm all for it. The problem was, at the time, the period coming out of the Civil War, during Reconstruction, we had the rise of a Democratic Party led by the KKK. We had a slowly growing rise of progressivism that really took hold right after the turn of the 20th century. And they were having none of that. So we missed that opportunity. And I'm sad that we missed that opportunity.
Well, in fact, let me make that edge just a little sharper.
Okay.
That the Democratic Party, as it transformed it went from the party of slavery to the party of Jim Crow and the KKK, and part of it stays that way for a long time. And also there's an infusion of progressivism, right? That's starting to expand in the late 19th century, early 20th century. That Democratic Party, it wasn't interested in reparations for former slaves. It wanted to control them. It wanted to terrorize them. It wanted to stop them from participating in civic life.
Right.
It's a fascinating period immediately after the Civil War. There's a period known as Reconstruction, which goes from the end of the wars in 1865 all the way up more than a decade to 1877, when the Union Army is occupying many southern states. And the Union Army is the one conducting the elections, and it's prohibiting many who served in the Confederate Army aren't allowed to run for office or vote in elections. And in the Reconstruction South, in multiple states, and I'm talking about places like Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina, black free men and women, meaning they used to be slaves, now they're free. They were not only voting in elections, they were running for office and getting elected. I mean, it was astounding. And every one of them was running as a Republican. The Republican Party was the party that just ended slavery. And all that starts to change after Reconstruction ends. And the Democratic Party really can take control of everything. And this is when they start to come up with all kinds of tests and poll taxes, and and the Ku Klux Klan is engaging in terrorism. They figure out all kinds of ways to keep black people from voting and running for office. And so what happens is that little brief moment where blacks in the South are voting and participating in civil life, immediately it starts to go down. And by the way, I got to connect this to recent stories. You know, when Georgia just recently passed a new version of its voting laws and rules, and part of it was prohibiting electioneering. Electioneering means you can't have political parties or politically interested groups at the polling place either bribing people, giving them food, drinks, money, whatever, or threatening them. Either is a form of electioneering. You're trying to change how people vote. Georgia adopted that law. All 50 states have versions of that. All 50 states say you can't engage in electioneering right there where people are voting. And one of the big reasons for those anti-electioneering laws was the terrorism and the threats that were going on at polling places in the South after Reconstruction, when the Democratic Party was in charge of those elections.
And as a little tangent to that, it does make you question mail-in voting and all of that a little bit, because it's a whole lot harder to control or to protect people from being harassed to vote in a certain way when they're doing it at home. And what's really interesting about it, I didn't think about this before, but Hillary Clinton, one of her excuses in What Really Happened, I think that was the name of her book, of why she lost, or why I don't remember the name of it, but
no, I think it was what happened ? And then her name was on the bottom, Hillary Rodham Clinton. Right. And I remember looking at that thinking, this is so funny, because the answer is right there at the bottom of the cover. What happened? Hillary Clinton happened. She ran. That's what happened.
So Hillary claimed one of the reasons she lost is that when a husband was a Republican, husbands were pressuring their wives to vote in a certain way. Now, there's two problems here. The first problem is I know very few husbands who can pressure their wives to do anything. It's usually the other way around.
I agree with that. Yes, it is.
So I have some concerns about that comment in and of itself. But the second thing is, if you really believe that's happening, then why would you want more mail-in balloting? Why would you want more husbands looking over their wives' shoulders
as
to tell them how to vote?
Yeah.
Anyway, that was a sidetrack, but it all just makes me a little crazy.
Yeah.
The point I was trying to get to earlier, though, was we saw this huge shift in the 1960s towards this acceptance of critical theory, which evolved into critical race theory. And when you look at the Reconstruction period, there was a lot of things working against the newly freed slaves.
Yes.
And at the same time, they were doing a lot of things really, really, really successfully.
Yes.
They had schools that were private for them that were better than most of the public schools that white kids were going to. Their families, they had a lower divorce rate, a lower fatherless rate than most white families. They had high levels of reading scores and math scores. These, despite everything that was working against them, they were excelling. They were becoming this unbelievably powerful and important part of American society that you just think about if they could have kept that trajectory and they didn't have all the things holding them back, you think about how amazing that community would be, the improvements and the inventions and the different things that would have come out of that community. And then all of a sudden in the 1960s, we start saying, yeah, you're at a disadvantage. You need to understand that you are at a natural disadvantage and you have to have the government take care of you.
Right.
And that's where critical race theory came in.
You need affirmative action. You need subsidies. You need special treatment. Now, it's absolutely true. What you're saying, Dave, is one of the most important and little known stories in American history. And it's an amazing story. Our friend Bob Woodson likes to say when you look through American history, when white people were at their worst, black people were at their best. And it's true. What you were just describing extends even back into the period of slavery. And this is one of these big subjects. I want to keep, we're going to talk about this more because there's a lot more to say about it. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson was president of the United States, had already announced his big, Great Society, huge expansion of government programs, government spending, and a PhD in sociology named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who later became a very prominent United States senator for a long time. He was working in the Department of Labor? I think he was in the Department of Labor. And he produced this study. It was on the crisis of the Negro family. And the subtitle was A Call for National Action, which should raise some eyebrows right there. Right? Clearly, he's looking for a reason to expand government more.
He hadn't heard Reagan's 9 words yet.
Right.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
And I'm here to help. That's right. That's what it is. And what Moynihan did is in the mid-1960s, he analyzed the data, collected the data, and it certainly was true. Black family was being devastated as an institution, meaning many of them were not intact. A majority, already up around 60% or more in some communities, 60% of children born into black families were born into a household where at least one of the parents wasn't there. And Moynihan rightly pointed out, this has never happened before. There's never been a large group of people in the United States or anywhere else where huge numbers of their children are growing up fatherless, typically is what that meant, or growing up not knowing either of their parents, something like this. And he sounded this alarm, says something needs to be done. Now, the really sad part of this story is it gets even worse. So, fast forward a decade later, those numbers had all gotten even higher. By the mid-'70s. Think of, Jimmy Carter as president. Crime in places like New York City it was just terrible. In urban settings, the rate of black babies being born into non-intact homes, meaning where the parents, the baby's mom and dad were not both there, that rate was reaching 100% in many neighborhoods. I mean, virtually every black baby born was being born into a fatherless household. And Moynihan attributed that to slavery, to the legacy of slavery. He's very explicit about this, that when you go back and you look at the history of slavery, slavery was, the laws of slavery in every state identified the legal status of a baby born to a slave. It was the same as the legal status of the mother. And there was a reason for this, an ugly reason, because a whole lot of mulatto children were being born on slave plantations where the father was the slaver, was the white slaver, the white plantation owner, or one of the white workers or managers raping the slaves. And so if the legal status of the baby followed the father, these would be free free people. So instead, it was based on the legal status of the mother. The mother's a slave, then her baby is a slave, regardless of who the father is. And Moynihan makes a big deal about that it was a matriarchal society within the plantations among slaves. The fathers were not needed, were not present, and therefore blacks developed a culture of growing up in a mother-centered homes. And even after slavery ended, this was Moynihan's thesis.
Right.
After slavery ended, black people in America just continued to live that way, where fathers weren't present in the lives of their children and all this. Well, this fellow, I have his book here right in front of me, Herbert Gutman. 10 years later, after Moynihan, Gutman was a historian. And so he said, is that true? He just raised a simple question. Is that really true? And he went back and did what I believe remains the most comprehensive study of family status among blacks in North America from 1750. So he even starts before the American Revolution.
British North America.
All the way up to basically the New Deal,
Right.
to Franklin Roosevelt's time in the 1930s and 40s. And what he demonstrates in excruciating detail is that the family unit among slaves, and then later after the Civil War, among newly freed black people during Jim Crow, during the rise of the KKK, during the rise of progressivism, all those obstacles, black families remained intact. I'm talking intact rates of 92, 93, 94%, meaning unless a father died or in rare cases a family would break apart, but those were the outliers. The norm was a black man, a black woman would get married. Now, during slavery, they couldn't legally marry, but they would consider themselves married. They would often have little ceremonies right there on the plantation. They were married. Everyone around them recognized their marriage, and they would have children, and they would raise their children. There was even an ongoing discussion among white plantation owners on the question, is it in our business interest, the plantation business interest, to recognize and protect these black families of slaves or not? And the general consensus that emerged among white plantation owners was respect their families, the families of slaves, because as long as you have an intact family on a plantation, that is a powerful disincentive against running away.
Right.
Because if they run away, they're running away from their parents, their brothers and sisters, their family.
And let's be clear about that. We're not at all condoning that all of a sudden these plantation owners had a good heart.
Oh, no.
And were doing anything.
This was a business calculation.
This was a calculated decision, and I think it's partially what you were saying. They're not going to run away, and it was partially the same reason you started to see a lot of those mulatto children being born. It was the end of the Atlantic slave trade. They didn't have a pathway to get more slaves. Slaves started becoming much more expensive. And for these I have no problem saying it. These were awful human beings who were slave owners, who were plantation owners. These awful human beings were looking for every way possible to keep getting more slaves and to keep having more slaves available to them. And they knew they had to breed more. Yep. So they were either having their slaves breed more slaves, or they were raping their slaves to get more slaves. These were awful human beings. Yep. But at the same time, that was a business decision, and yet these families stayed intact, and they were there for each other, and they took care of each other.
And here's what I want to suggest. This is a little cutting edge, and this is a little counterintuitive. I think the general way most people look at that story with this sense of, a rightful sense of pity, those poor slaves, and then later after the abolition of slavery, those poor black Americans were undergoing threats and harassment, and including arson and murder and rape by the KKK and other democratic groups of terrorism. And that's true. It was terrible and it's horrible. But there's also a way to look at those black people during slavery and during Jim Crow and say, my God, how resilient were they?
Yeah.
Look at how resilient they didn't just give up. They didn't just say, I'm done and all, commit suicide. They powered through. We talked about that word struggle before. They struggled through against incredible odds, against a bleak future, and they were incredibly resilient. And once the shackles of slavery were thrown off forever by way of constitutional amendment, Black Americans, in the face of terrible prejudices and discrimination and ugliness and terrorism, they were entrepreneurial. They started launching businesses and building. When white hotel owners wouldn't rent rooms to blacks, you know what many blacks did? They went and built their own hotels. In places like Philadelphia, New York, Miami, Atlanta, Georgia, they went and they built their own hotels. Some of them would rent rooms to anybody who wanted. Others would say, we're renting rooms only to black people. It was their property. They could do whatever they wanted to do.
Capitalism loves a vacuum.
That's exactly right. Then you get into the New Deal period, the Great Depression in the 1930s and the 1940s. And while FDR's, all his New Deal policies, which are basically taking money and transferring it around to others, and padding the pockets of a bunch of bureaucrats. FDR's policies made the economics of the Great Depression terrible for everybody. It hit Black Americans especially hard because in the 30s and the 40s, the general average there, the unemployment rate was between 20 and 25% total for the United States. I mean, think of that. That's 1 out of 4 Americans out of work. But among black people, it was upwards of 40 to 50% because there were a bunch of white supremacists and a bunch of racists who owned businesses. And when FDR's policies started squeezing and hurting a business, very often the first people to get fired were the black employees.
Well, and to go back to a conversation we had a few weeks ago, especially with some of our chapter members, that's when you started seeing implementations of things like minimum wage to try to get the black populations out of there. That's when you started seeing the development from Margaret Sanger of the eugenics movement and Planned Parenthood, which, by the way, last week for the very first time, Planned Parenthood advocates finally publicly disavowed Margaret Sanger.
That's fair.
It was the first time they finally publicly came out and said, okay, what she was doing was wrong, but they're still saying, but what came out of it is good.
Right.
So we're still not there, but
her dream was to have a Planned Parenthood abortion clinic in every black neighborhood.
Right. You go through the Great Depression, you get more of the black community unemployed. They can't afford to have children, so then they'll start, because of minimum wage laws and everything else. So then they get pregnant and they say, well, let's just terminate the child. And her path to that means we're not going to have a next generation of black families.
And so you think of all those forces, all those obstacles and challenges black Americans were facing in the 1930s and 40s, and at the end of the Depression, black Americans have the highest intact family rate in the United States, higher than white people, higher than anybody else. They were getting married, staying married, and raising their kids. In no way, I don't want to say life was rosy or easy. It wasn't. My point is the opposite. They were incredibly resilient against all these obstacles. And so the truth is, and this is something no critical race theorist will admit, the progressivism of the 1960s, the Great Society, all those subsidy programs, entitlement programs, paying mothers, incentivizing with payments, cash payments, to not have the father of their children around, affirmative action being targeted directly at black people. You need these special treatments and special perks. You need special loans from banks if you have black skin. You need extra points added onto your SAT scores if you have black skin. The progressivism of the 1960s did what neither slavery nor Jim Crow nor the Great Depression could do, and it is break apart the black family. Slavery didn't break apart the black family. Jim Crow didn't break apart the black family. FDR and all of his socialist policies didn't break apart the black family because none of it was targeted at blacks. Progressives don't start targeting blacks until the late 50s and early 1960s.
And they did it very clearly by just saying, look at everything you've been through and you're still not successful, it's not possible. You live in a world where it's not possible for you to be successful, especially in America. And this was the beginning of this anti-American movement. But in America, it is not possible for you to be successful. It's not possible for you to stay a family and have a good life. You have to rely on us. You have to vote for us. You have to keep us in office because we're your only chance. And
this leads to one of the most obscene features of modern contemporary critical race theory today, which is this notion that you are engaged in injustice simply by the color of your skin. The whole question of justice versus injustice, these are moral terms. And in the realm of moral philosophy, part of making that, trying to make that distinction between what's right versus what's wrong, or what is just versus unjust, personal choice is always an indispensable component, right? For you to do something truly unjust or wrong, you have to choose to do that thing. It's why the criminal law, right, usually demonstrate you have to show that there was a choice, there was some intention there. And what critical race theory is doing is say, no, it's not about what choices you make. In fact, you might be a nice person. You might be a guy who has strong, positive, good feelings towards people with black skin and brown skin and others. It doesn't matter. The mere fact that you have white skin means you are part of the culture of oppression.
Right.
You are oppressing people simply by being, and you need to be made aware of that.
Right.
You need to be actively anti-racist. That's Kendi's main point. It's not enough to be neutral. It's not enough to call for non-discrimination or to call for equal protection law. No. You need to be anti-racist, which means calling for discrimination in the form of preferences and privileges based on race. You need to be quieter. You need to talk less because you're part of this oppressive class. You have white skin. And if any of this doesn't make sense to you, your failure to understand is yet more evidence of your inherent racism.
Right. And as we wrap, I want to go back to something you said at the very beginning of that little comment, and that was you were talking about individual choice, and you were talking about how today critical race theory says you don't if you're black, you don't have individual choice. The deck is stacked so far against you, you don't have individual choice. That was the plantation life. On the plantation life, you didn't have individual choice. You should have had it. You had a natural right to your life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, but you weren't given that. Right. It was taken from you. It was prevented from you. That's what made it morally, objectively, truthfully wrong.
Yep.
And now they're saying you still don't have the same thing. And that's why so many of the current outspoken black, I don't want to say conservatives or Republicans, but the blacks on the freedom side of this argument today, the Candace Owens type, they call it the Democratic plantation. Because still to this day, the Democrats are telling you the same way you did when you were when they were slaves on those plantations. You don't have individual choice. You live in a world today where you don't have individual choice. And the reality is you do. Yep. The reality is you just have to go out and take it. And there's a lot of people who just want great people to work with and great people to be friends with and great people to have in their lives. And if you just make that choice and choose the American idea, choose the American dream, life can be a whole lot better.
This is the thing, right? It's the American idea. We should be calling for the equal protection of the laws, equal for the individual rights of every American, of every color. And the truth is, some Americans don't want to associate with some other Americans for various reasons. Some might be based on skin color. Some might be based on religion. Some might be, I don't like the guy down the street because he's stinky and I don't want to hang out with him. Okay. Part of freedom means people choosing who they want to interact with, whether it's in their house, in their business, in their social settings. That's part of freedom. That's what a free society does, is they freely try to make friends with whom they want to be friends, and they don't try with whom they don't. And that's why we should be demanding nothing less than freedom for all Americans, equal protection of their individual rights, their private property, their natural liberty, and anyone who stands up and says, what you say doesn't matter. What matters is the color of your skin. They should be shamed out of the room. They should be shamed away.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And until then, we will continue to encourage people to shame progressives for that very reason. We will encourage people to continue fighting for the American idea because it's truly objectively good.
Yep. That's why we're the guardians, Dave.
Nos sumus custodes.